today's web event titled Diversity Challenges in B2B Enterprises. It is my pleasure to introduce Sigrid Senemal, Assistant Vice President of Conferences. Sigrid, you may begin.
Thank you so much, Jen. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Diversity Best Practices web seminar entitled Diversity Challenges in B2B Enterprises. Again, thank you for joining today. We are very honored to have Joe Santana from Siemens to be our featured speaker today. Before we get started, though, please mark your calendars for 2 upcoming events. Our first session coming up is Beyond the Business Case, Leveraging Diversity for Innovation and Client Success. That's July 29th in Milwaukee, hosted by Johnson Controls and Harley-Davidson. Our flagship event, please mark your calendars for that as well, October 6th through the 7th. That's our Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Summit in Washington, the gala being on October 6th, where we celebrate the CEO Leadership Award. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Joe Santana. He is Senior Director of Diversity for Siemens in the USA. He has a broad professional background, including sales, operations, ran over $45 million business, finance, and organizational development. A few of his accomplishments in the diversity arena include the design and launch of a countrywide Siemens diversity strategy, development board, the design and implementation of an objective diversity capability maturity assessment tool, the design and rollout of a diversity practice guidelines and policies, as well as the embedment of diversity management and leadership skills into standard management training programs. A prolific published author, Joe is co-author of 1 book on management and a chapter contributor in several other books. He is also author of hundreds of published articles and sought-after media commentators who have served as a guest speaker and exhaustive panelist at external conventions, client symposiums, radio and television programs. Last year, Siemens was awarded the prestigious CEO Diversity Leadership Award for their D&I accomplishments. Joe?
Good. Great to be here. And thank you so much for that introduction. It makes me feel very old when you say all these different things that I've done. I've just been around for a long time. Thank you very much, Sigrid.
My pleasure.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Today what I want to do is I want to have a discussion with you around this topic of creating your own B2B diversity best practices, which goes back to some of the challenges or addressing some of the challenges that B2Bs have. Now, thanks to Sigrid's introduction, I think you have a little bit of an idea about me and who I am. What I'd like to do is bring up a polling question to sort of kick off getting to know a little bit about you and some of the things that you have going on in your various environments. So the only question that I have for you is simply this. What is the origin of your company's current set of diversity practices? And as you can see the responses there where it says we copied 100% from best practices in other companies, or we copied 75% to 99, 50 to 74, et cetera, all the way down to 6. We created all our own practices. The copying part is not bad. I know that that has a bad connotation sometimes. But what it means is that that maybe a number of your practices, anywhere from all of them to a high percentage of them, were things that you learned about from other companies and from reading literature or from your association with diversity best practices and other members, and that you simply took these things that work somewhere else and you brought them into your organization because you know that they work, or they obviously had worked somewhere else before. Created your own would mean that you essentially perhaps took things that you learned elsewhere and modified them to suit your environment, or took ideas perhaps from other disciplines outside of diversity and inclusion and modified those. And we can talk a little bit about that, or we will talk a little more about that later on. So essentially that's it. So copying simply means you saw something that worked, you took it, and you used it because you know it worked elsewhere. And to what degree you did that is the first 5 questions. The last question is, you didn't look at anything that anybody else was doing, or if you did, you used it only as raw material, and then you pretty much created and invented your own. So I'm assuming that as I've been talking, you've been selecting, and I think after we have a certain percentage of your responses, those will be displayed on the screen so that all of you can get an idea, and I can also see them and see, where you are in terms of how you've, developed your practices in your particular organization. So I see the poll is closed, and here are the results. And let's keep those up just for a second and talk about them. So a small number of you, about 10% of you, say, we just basically copied best practices from other companies. We saw stuff that worked, we took it, and we applied it. A larger number of you copied a smaller percentage. The interesting thing is that a very, very small, in fact, it's zero, I think, not because I see a little bar there, so I'm assuming that it doesn't mean that no one was answered positively, number 6, but that possibly a very small number that averaged out to less than 1% answered yes to that. The biggest category, or the biggest 2 categories, are the ones where there is at least, let's say, 25 to 49% or less that was copied, and a lot was created. So this is good to know. I think, to talk about how it is that I got to the place where I ended up writing the white paper that was published by Diversity Best Practices, and this topic came up, is because when I traveled to different companies, when I first came into the role that I'm in right now, back in 2005, I had worked in one of Siemens division areas, and in that area I had been involved in diversity, but I had not had sort of that overall view of what was going on in the company as a whole, because again, I lived in one division. But when I came into the role that I'm in now, and I had responsibility for the whole United States, and I started looking at the different things that were going on, I found something in the various companies that looked pretty much like what you've got here. There were some practices that were learned through books, through magazine articles, through discussions with partners and friends and other people in other organizations that were applied within the company. And then there were some things that were somewhat developed using the ideas that were acquired through other organizations or through meetings or through formal learning that were developed. But one of the things that I found that was really challenging, whether it was inside or outside of Siemens, relative to this migrating or copy and paste of best practices, is that in a lot of cases, something that is a best practice in one organization didn't necessarily perform like a best practice in another organization. I'm sure that most of you that have been in a lot of different function areas as I have seen that before, that sometimes the best HR system, let's say for one group or one company, may not necessarily function the same or produce the same results when you put it into another company. Or one example that I recently read about in an industry, in the production industry, was a company that wanted to increase their productivity. They engaged with top consultants to determine how they could increase their productivity. And what the consultants advised them to do based on best practices was to use a piecework approach so that people would be paid by what they produce as opposed to being paid a flat salary. And after doing this for a little while, the company looked and found that there had not been any real improvement in productivity. And when they started digging deeper through HR and through other groups, they found that most of the people who worked there were working for second incomes in their family, and the primary thing that they valued was time more than they did actually making more money. And so the approach that was the best practice and had worked in other places but was recommended by the consultants and applied didn't work in this particular environment because the workforce that was there wasn't motivated the same way as the workforces where this had worked. The company switched their approach to one where they gave people more flex time and their productivity went up. So they needed a different practice that would perform as a best practice in their environment as opposed to something that was a best practice because it had produced results elsewhere. And so in the area of diversity, it's pretty much very similar in that what we find in many cases is that while something may work somewhere else within our particular company, it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And it may not actually work in our organization. So a lot of our discussion today really centers on the idea of, so how do you address that? And how is that particularly important to companies that are B2Bs or business to business as opposed to business to consumers? Well, the answer to that is that most companies that actually in the beginning developed a lot of the practices that we see in diversity today were companies that were focused on consumers and the changing demographics of these consumers. And those tended to be sort of the pioneer companies because they clearly saw that the buyer of their product and service was changing, and they needed to make sure that their products appealed to the new buyer demographic. B2Bs came in some cases a little bit later on. Some came in earlier, others came in later, but primarily weren't as impacted in the beginning by some of the changing demographics. The challenge then is that a lot of the cases, B2Bs, when they're shopping for practices, they usually shop in places that have had practices that have worked for a long time, practices that have been proven in terms of producing results, and very likely that's going to be in a B2C environment because B2Cs actually were trailblazers in many cases in some of these practices. So right there, one of the challenges is the fact that the business model of the companies that sometimes B2Bs are looking at to copy is relatively different from theirs. And the other is that even when you're copying another B2B, and the example that I gave in the beginning of the company that was producing certain products, and they went to a piecework model, is that the underlying dynamics may be different in your particular organization as in that case. And so what works in one may not work in another. So I'm going to share with you 3 areas first, and then some other areas in addition to that, where we looked at developing our own way of doing things at Siemens in order to address our own unique environment. And of course, we did take inspiration, and we did take some good ideas and see some positive things going on around us with business partners, friends, organizations like DBP, where we, myself and others, met other people and had discussions about what they were doing and what worked for them and so forth. But we took these things and we basically looked at how can we fit them into our environment in the most effective way to produce the kind of results we want. And how do we make what we do as competitive as possible, because clearly we want to compete for market share, as all of you do, and our D&I efforts are part of competing for market share as well as competing for the best talent that's out there. So how do we make sure that the things that we're doing make us as competitive as possible? That's the top line question. So 3 areas that we looked at, that we had this in mind and we were looking at, were developing our business case statement, in terms of also getting value out of affinity networks or employee resource groups that had sprung up in various parts of the company. And the other was a unique sort of challenge that we had, which may be more common to B2Bs than it is to B2Cs, and certainly was a very big one for us, which is overcoming a lack of brand recognition by job candidates in terms of having people know who we were as a company. So let me share some stories with you as we go through this. First of all, in developing our own unique business case. First, let me give you a little snapshot of Siemens by way of an explanation of how we're set up and what we're like as a company. In the United States, there's about 70,000 people that work for Siemens. These people work for several divisions that focus on 3 sectors, and under those sectors, each of those divisions may have certain specific areas of focus. But the top line sectors are the healthcare, the energy, and the industry sector. And so you have people that are focusing on things like medical imaging, supporting diagnostics. You have people that are focusing on things like infrastructure, computer infrastructure support, outsourcing You have others of those people that are focusing on building technologies, others that are focusing on the production of energy, wind, solar, different types of energy, as well as devices that are used to regulate office buildings, commercial space, lighting, and so forth. So you have this wide array of people across a number of businesses and divisions that are connected to each other as part of these sectors and all roll up to this company called Siemens, which in the United States has 70,000 people. When I came into this particular role, what I found was that there were many of them that had their own sort of business cases for what they did. Some of those business cases were very clearly tailored to their particular division and their business. Others were a little more broad, and they sounded like the right thing to do type statements, but it was very difficult to sort of link it to exactly how it all connected into the business. So what we did was, rather than going out and picking out, going on Google and looking at, different business case statements by X amount of companies and sort of piecing one together, or looking at, let's say, for example, what some of our partners had, what we did was essentially we sat down and we spent a lot of time asking ourselves, as a company, what is it that we pride ourselves on? What is it that we are trying to accomplish? What is it that we do? What is it that we how is it that diversity and inclusion impacts us personally in terms of our being able to meet the objectives of our business? And what you see up here on this slide 8 is what we came up with, which was very much related to us as a company. And just reading very quickly, it says that diversity is one of the key sources of Siemens' competitive edge. And it talks about how diversity of employees and business partners fuels innovative solutions that made us a successful leader for more than 150 years. Because innovation for us is the key to what we do, to keep coming up with new solutions, new ideas for our customers. And then we connect it right back to people and to our business partners that we have, and how by continuing to diversify these and to leverage the diversity of that workforce and these suppliers, we can continue to drive forward and maintain and build on that competitive advantage. So we built that as a statement that pulled together all the different companies, whether they were in the energy area, in the healthcare area, or in the industry area. This one statement linked together our competitive advantage across our history, across our drive to always have the most excellent people. And it was very action-oriented. So it was very broad, and it was very appropriate for all of the different Siemens companies. But this was something that we thought was so important that we didn't want to just take something that was out there and say, okay, this sounds good, because of changing demographics, we want to look more like our customers and so forth. No, we wanted something that was very unique and very specific to us as a company. And we often refer back to this when making decisions about approaches that we're going to take in different things. Because, again, we do see it as being more than just a business case, but we also call it an enabling statement that gives somewhat of a context to a lot of the things that we do. So that was one area where, again, we looked at a lot of what a lot of other people were doing, but we put the time in to really build something that was very unique and very specific to us. The other area that we focused on a lot was our employee resource groups. Now, many of your companies probably have these. You can call them affinity networks or employee groups or employee resource groups. And I know that when I first came into the role that I have now, that Siemens already had a number of these groups. Some of these groups were more engaged in terms of doing things that really enforce good practices in the business. They were helping to develop people. They were helping to create engagement. They were helping to make a giant company seem smaller to various cross-sections of the demographics that make up our employee base. Other groups I found were not in the beginning, as they were there, but it was really one of the things that I found humorous was whenever I got together with a group and they said to me, what do you think our goals should be? And my question was, well, why did you form the group, right? Because usually when you form a group, you have a goal. But what happened is, in essence, they saw that other organizations within the Siemens family, as well as outside, were forming these groups, thought it was a good idea, formed the group, and became a solution looking for a problem. One of the things that we made sure that we did very early on was articulate a very clear guideline for these affinity networks as to why people should form them, when they should form them, how they should run them. We didn't give them the content, but we gave them the context so that when they formed these groups, they started with a goal first. But again, getting back to the idea of the difference between, let's say, for example, a B2C in terms of their employee resource groups and a B2B resource groups. In a B2C, a resource group can also serve an important function of being somewhat of a focus group where the company can learn more and more about their potential customers, especially if their employees represent their customers in terms of the demographics of the customers. But in a B2B, you're kind of a few transactions removed from actually dealing directly with the customer. So that's not really a role that these groups can play as effectively within a B2B. What we found, though, is that these groups do play a fabulous role in the B2B environment in terms of helping, as I said before, to make the company seem somewhat smaller to various demographics. They can help us in terms of helping to create opportunities for networking, opportunities for mentoring, opportunities for people to actually engage and have direct contact with senior executives. And also, very similar to the B2C environment, or a modification of what the B2C environment does with the focus group approach, it also provides us, in many cases, one of the things that we've done is we've looked to these groups to help us fine-tuning our recruiting message. So I'll give you an example of one situation where we did that. We were putting together a package that recruiters would use when they went out recruiting and talking to prospective candidates. And rather than having 2 or 3 recruiters sit together in a room and put together a slide presentation about what we do and how we do it, what we did was we had them put together first a draft and then bring in members that represented our different affinity networks to look at the materials from the standpoint of, would I find these materials attractive and engaging if I were a job candidate? So in essence, we had them look at all these materials and critique them, and took their critique, embodied it in changes that were made to the presentation, to the pacing, to the positioning of different types of information. Things were moved around in different ways. And what we found as a result of that was that we ended up with a way of presenting information and of engaging the workforce in a more effective way with a broader demographic appeal than what the original product would have provided us with. So that's a couple of examples of ERGs, and one specific one in the area of fine-tuning our recruiting message. And we look to these groups on a regular basis to give us that type of feedback in terms of how they see the messages that we're putting out there and what they think about these messages and whether they find them engaging or not. And then one of the other things that we had to overcome that I mentioned earlier was this brand recognition by job candidates in the area of recruiting. And this is primarily when we had a really strong recruiting effort going on, and we were looking for ways to attract more and more candidates to ourselves. One of the things that we found is that unlike brand name consumer organizations who spend a lot of money getting their name out there on a regular basis in front of the public, companies like ours, especially a company like Siemens, doesn't really put a lot of advertisement out there like a cereal company or a soda company or or even some of the very well-known software or other engineering type companies that have become household names. So what happens is when you go to a job fair, you're not going to get as much traffic as somebody who, let's say, for example, is one of those household names. So one of the things that we did here, and this is something that we pieced together, a practice that we pieced together, just as a result of looking at what worked and didn't work, was we essentially, whenever we were going to be involved in any kind of recruiting effort or event, we made sure that we got involved to a level where we were going to be providing some of the learning workshops or seminars within that particular event. So let's say the event had a couple of breakout tracks for the sake of, one event we had like about 10 breakout tracks. We actually had 6 of those. And so you have a Siemens instructor who's doing a breakout track on a particular area of engineering practice, another one doing a breakout track on something else. And each one of them had a specific program and message of information that was useful to the audience that was there. They also had at least 1 or 2 slides in the beginning that introduced them, introduced the company, and pointed to the fact that we had a booth sitting out there on the event floor. And what we found was that the number of people that were coming over to our booth because they learned about us through having one of these presenters talking to them at one of the tracks increased dramatically over the amount that we had gotten in the past by giving out pins or cup holders or different things that had our name on it. Because by having that person there talking about, this particular topic and showing expertise, and also then talking a little bit in the beginning about the company, it gave the company more of a face and a name and a brand, and it attracted people to us. The other thing that we found is that we were getting so many people that in many cases we had more people than we had available positions for. But we also didn't want to lose these people because in many cases you'll meet people that you don't have a job for today, but you may have a job for tomorrow, and the immediate tomorrow or the long-term tomorrow. So what we started doing is we started collecting the names of people who came to our area in a database. And if that person, if there was an opportunity that matched that person, then the person was matched to the opportunity. If the person, there was no opportunity for that person right now, but they were thought of as a really good candidate, we had their email address, their name, some general information about them. We gave that information to our sourcing people to put into a relationship tracking tool so that they could keep track. And in the future, when we had openings and we wanted to have a nice, broad, diverse slate, when they tapped into their database and they looked in the names of people that we had met in the past and so forth, there were those names that were picked up at National Society of Black Engineer, Women Engineer, and all the other things that we engage in across the country. So that was something that we built specifically because of the fact that as a company, we didn't have the kind of brand recognition here in the United States that many of the other the B2Cs have, and in some cases even some B2Bs have. So again, this is not a practice that we picked up from somewhere else, but this is something that we pieced together as opposed to just basically saying, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll make sure that the name Siemens is stamped on every canvas bag where people put their books and so forth. And we've done stuff like that before, but found that it wasn't as effective. This worked. This is a best practice for us. Now, is it a best practice for you or someone else? It may be. It may not be. You may be able to take pieces of it and modify them to make it a best practice for you. And the same with the aforementioned affinity network approach, and the same with the aforementioned approach that we use for developing our business case. So these are just a few ideas. Now, I'm going to give you actually 3 other best practices. And what's different about these from the others is that the other best practices that I talked about within our environment were best practices that were inspired by the other things done in the D&I space, in the diversity and inclusion space, development of business cases, leveraging employee resource groups, tracking people and engaging people to come aboard, top talent to your company across the broadest spectrum possible. All these things are somewhat part and parcel with D&I. These best practices were built on disciplines that are really not so much a part of D&I, but actually a more holistic sort of type of business practice or business practices. One of them at the very top is a roadmap phase process, which I'll talk about a little bit. The other is an organizational setup for a large company like ours that's made up of all these sectors and divisions. And the third, which is to your lower left, is a capability maturity model adaptation that we use. And I'll tell you a little bit about us, a little more about us before I jump into going into these practices that will give you a little more context as to why we found it necessary to build these different practices. So, in the United States, as I mentioned before, Siemens has a lot of different businesses that came into the Siemens family primarily by acquisition, as well as companies that extended out from abroad and started doing business here in the United States. As a result of that, because these companies have been here for a long time, Siemens diversity efforts in these companies, many go back for many, many years, some more than others, to some of the companies that we acquired. Some were developed by companies in response to their particular environment in terms of the talent they needed to attract and engage, and their overall business environment. So when I came into my role in 2005, what I found was that we did have a lot of diversity practices in the company, but they were different. They were practiced in a different way in different companies, and there was very little connection and leveraging between what one company was doing and what the other company was doing, even though they all bore the name Siemens. So one of the things that I saw as an ideal way to increase our competitive advantage in terms of attracting talent and in terms of our brand was to begin to create a little more structure, uniformity, and governance around how we did things in various aspects of our D&I program. We didn't want to take away the ability for a division to customize things in a way that was appropriate for their environment. But by the same token, we didn't want to have everyone doing everything so differently that there was no connectivity between different parts of supplier programs and our various outreach programs. So it was with that in mind that we developed these approaches. And as you could see in the introduction when Sigrid was talking about my background is not from HR. I actually come from the business and worked in a number of other operational and sales roles. So as a result, I had seen practices used in other areas, and I found good application for them in the D&I environment, especially specific to these particular needs. So the first area was this roadmap toward competitiveness. One of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to systematically look at all the practices we had in various parts of the company, determine who was doing what, well, and how could we do that across the entire company in discrete areas of practice. So let's say, for example, in the way a council was run, in the way employee resource groups were developed, in the way supplier diversity practices were developed, and so forth down the line, across all these different, in training and so forth, across all these different substream areas. And in order to do that, what I did was I borrowed from the process that's used in the business world to put together projects where we expect a return on the project. So in the beginning, all the activities have to do with organizing what needs to be done, determining how are we doing it now, what best practices exist, what targets should we have. The second piece, which I call normalizing, is the area where you begin to create uniformity by moving everyone to that selected target way of performing. And then the final phase, which I call excel in this particular model, is where you begin to leverage the benefits, whether it's by creating collateral material for your recruiting efforts, for your business efforts, but you begin to take advantage of the fruits of the efforts of your optimization and normalization stages. So let's say, for example, you could have, as an example for this, let's say you're doing this in your philanthropy area and you want to increase your philanthropy to a particular target group. You look across the company and you've got different things going on. You select something that you feel is the most effective. Then you target what it is that you want everyone to do. You get them marching in that one direction. And then as a result of that, you produce collateral material that you can leverage during the final stage. So that's a pretty broad explanation of how that would work. And as I talk about the other two models, you'll see how all of these tie together. So the next thing that we needed to have when I came into this role is we needed to have a country or cluster level organization, an organization across the United States. Now, some of our companies, in fact, almost every one of them, already had employee networks and diversity councils, and their CEOs were engaged within their particular divisions with these diversity councils to various degrees. But what was missing was the glue that tied it all together. So to that end, what we did was we created this group called the Diversity Board. And the Diversity Board was comprised of the heads of diversity councils in the different companies who got together in a different group with myself to put together strategies for the entire company. So when we were looking for a new strategy, rather than having each company creating its own individual strategy, we created these strategies together at the diversity board level, and we wanted to make sure that it passed two tests. One, that it was appropriate for all our different divisions in terms of supporting that division's diversity goals for their attraction of talent, for their engagement of talent, for their market and business efforts, and also that it was built in such a way that we could leverage the efforts of any of the companies across all the companies. So we wanted to have best of both worlds, which is as much uniformity as we could have, while at the same time having some customized flexibility to help meet the needs of each individual company. And then what we did was, rather than each diversity council chair going to their CEO or through their senior management team to run their ideas past them and get their approval, instead what we did was, whenever we came up with an idea through this diversity board of something that we wanted to apply and do through all our divisions, I would take that then to the council of our CEOs of our different sectors and divisions for their review and approval for implementation in all of their companies. So this creation of this diversity board and moving the strategy development piece out of each individual division and moving it to this country level enabled us then to begin to standardize and create more structure, governance, and uniformity while leaving flexibility across different things like how we ran councils, how we ran affinity networks, what we did for training, management training, supplier diversity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is something that we consider to be a best practice in our environment. It works for us. It's allowed us to create a lot of structure and governance. There may be pieces of this that are useful to some of you that are in organizations that are made up of these multiple parts, such as ours is. And then the last thing that we did, and for this we really went completely outside into the public domain, as it were, was we built this standardization and practice improvement tool, and we built it looking at the Carnegie Mellon capability maturity model. And I'll tell you how it's set up, and then I'll tell you how it works very briefly. So if we found that in a particular practice area that one of our companies wasn't doing something in that particular area, suppose that one of our companies had not yet developed, let's say, employee resource groups or affinity networks, that would be considered to be, none. But if the company had initiated and had maybe one or two people that were working on this, that would be considered to be something that was started, and it had maybe a champion, the person who was running around, a hero, that was really driving this and making sure that it worked, but there was no clear sort of goals and objectives for this group. It was just sort of like forming around some central ideas that hadn't been documented. There were no metrics around performance or performance improvement and so forth. Then we considered it to be initiated. Once those metrics were in place and everything had been documented, we considered it to be defined. And if it became part and parcel of the way the company did business, meaning that when people got their orientation, they also learned about all these different groups existing in the company, that there was a smooth succession process so that if the person who was chairing a group left, another person slid right into that without missing a beat. If this was just part of the way that company's DNA operated, we considered it to be institutionalized. And if they did it so well that others inside and outside wanted to copy what they were doing, we'd consider them a leader in that space. And this, we could use this across every single practice as a way of objectively determining the maturity level of a particular practice within each one of our various companies. And what this did was, it really was, it had two-part benefit for me, in that in the first benefit it had was that if I was sitting in a meeting and I asked the people that were there representing the chairs and leaders of diversity councils in, let's say, 4 different companies, if I said, do you currently have diversity training for your managers? And they said, yes. Well, that didn't tell me very much, because what I didn't know was it one person running around doing this training, and if they quit or they left or got promoted or got tired, the entire management diversity training would come to a halt? Had it been defined and reduced to a script that someone could take and give to someone else if that person had left, so that it would continue and it would survive that person's retirement or leaving that particular role? Was it part of the curriculum that was used for training all new managers so that it was a default offering? If you're becoming a manager, you're going to get this training, and therefore it's just part of the way that we train our managers in that company. Or were they doing it so well that it was something that should be copied, and that others in their business area were already looking to them to copy? So by having this model, when we were having a meeting and we were talking about this topic, or any topic, any substream, supplier, management training, anything, we could, in a very objective way, determine at what level were they performing. Were they at the beginning of doing this, or were they pretty much along? And there were some result components that were attached. Of course, different metrics for each type of practice. But what we did was we defined these very, very clearly. And what this did was, first of all, as I said in that first example, it gave us the ability to be able to gauge where the different parts were, but the different performances of the different companies that made us in the United States, the different components of our Siemens companies. But the other thing that it did was it also enabled us to be able to set very objective goals and say, for this particular practice, we want everyone to reach the level of being institutionalized. We want this to be at the institutionalized level. And that specifically means that it should be, let's say if it were training, part of your curriculum, it should have these objectives, it should produce these results, it should be measurable by these particular metrics and so forth. And so it became a very clear way of measuring whether we were moving forward in terms of improving our practices. And so using this approach, we were able to take the different practices that we had and move them more toward to a higher level of maturity and more uniformity. And if you look at this other slide here, you could see that we consider these 3 practices to be very much sort of the 3 ends of our triangle or cornerstones of our being able to improve our competitiveness relative to attraction of talent, retention of talent, as well as business, by continuing to take practices, put them through the maturity model, figure out where are you, figure out where should you be, go through phases of organizing, using this model, normalizing, pushing everyone to whatever level it was that we felt we needed to be, and leveraging this global or this actual this national organization, this U.S. organization, to be able to get approval to implement these uniform practices across the entire organization. And as a result of that, I think the organization has certainly seen a tremendous amount of progress in terms of what we've been able to achieve in the area of our diversity practices. Now, again, you know, the idea behind all of these, if you look back at each one of these, we started with 3 practices that are very much, you know, sort of the core practices within the D&I space. And then I showed you 3 other practices that were not sort of your traditional D&I type of practices, but they were practices that were important for the effectiveness and the success of our D&I initiative. And it certainly was something that we see as best practices within our environment. I'm sure that there are some pieces of that, if not whole components of it, that many of you can probably use as well. So just in wrapping this up, if we move here to the last slide, the message in the paper, and I think in all of these different examples, is that we didn't invent any of these approaches. We developed them by repurposing models from other disciplines, modifying best practices learned from others, modifying being the key word to meet our environment, and then combining a variety of different approaches from traditional D&I and outside traditional D&I. And when I look around, I see the results of that. I see that this is certainly something that's worked for us. It's no different from what the B&Cs and other companies who were the trailblazers had to do, which was to begin from sort of an empty whiteboard and draw and develop their practices. I think that today, despite the fact that we have this great history and this great treasure store of practices that we can tap into from our colleagues and friends in different organizations, that we still need to do that to make sure that all the different things that we're doing relate back to the needs of our specific organization as opposed to just being cut and pasted over. So the advice, as this slide here has there boldly on top of that spanning tree, is to seek inspiration from the best practices of others, not ready-made ideas. And you always have to keep improving and revising, even when there are best practices within your organization, because in this type of competition for talent and for business, and as demographics keep changing, there really is no steady state. But it's a constant moving target where the bar keeps going up, and we need to continue to be creative to continue to be effective in this particular space. So I am pretty much done with the presentation part of this, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to inform everyone, in order to ask a question, you may do so by pressing star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, to ask an audio question, press star 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster.
Joe, we do have an online question.
Okay, great.
And this one asks, how do you look for inspiration in developing new practice ideas?
Well, it comes from a number of different sources. I mean, I think that, I was fortunate in that because I've worked in so many different roles in the business side and in HR and in other components, that I've kind of seen different things applied in different ways. And in many cases found, like, for example, that capability maturity model, which I learned about when I was in the outsourcing business, and just basically repurpose a lot of that material. One of the things that I find that really is of value to continue to come up with new ideas all the time is really to read as much and as broadly as possible, and not just books that have the word diversity on them, but books across a whole gamut of eclectic topics. Like right now, I'm reading a number of books on things like, for example, the difference between human reflexive as well as reflective behavior. And, it sounds like, well, how is that connected to D&I? Actually, it is very connected to D&I, because what the book talks about is that a lot of these experiments that they've done show that people tend to react in many cases in a reflexive way as opposed to in a reflective way. So even if they learn something new, their behavior tends to default to what's comfortable for them. And understanding how to change that or how to re-engineer that is important to someone in DNI, because that's the way that you get past your own and other people's biases. You have to get past some of those reflexive behaviors and get people to reflect more and form new reflexive behaviors to change behavior patterns in yourself as well as others. So you see, even in something like that, that looks sort of like this, this new psychology topic, but it does have an application, and it does find its way then to training programs and other things that are of value to the organization. So I think that, and of course networking, DBP and other organizations like yours where we network and get to meet people, call people. I called a number of the members at DBP and asked them tons and tons of questions. I've interviewed quite a few of them on a number of topics, and talking to professionals in different fields, training, sales, marketing, how they do different things. You can find a host of ideas that you can just take and repurpose and come up with things that are just right for your D&I practice.
We have another electronic question.
Okay.
How do you measure the success of your diversity programs beyond the maturity model?
Beyond maturity model, we measure it, I think, not too different from what other, organizations probably do. The end goal, as I said, is to make sure that we attract, make sure that we engage people, and also make sure that we are effective in terms of meeting the needs of our customers and our markets in terms of how we leverage diversity in those areas. So, case in point, in the area of our attraction, what I look at is I look at things like, for example, in our pipeline of candidates that are coming in who have been given offers across an entire spectrum of diversity, how many people accepted those offers and came in. I'm not interested, the slate is good, but the question is, who are you hiring? And when you make an offer, who's accepting your offer? And if you're being turned down by people or not being accepted as much, then I see that as an opportunity for making yourself more attractive. I think we do well in that area, but there's always room for improvement. The other is things like, for example, in the area of our organization's retention, we want to make sure that we don't have gaps in our retention between any groups. All things being equal, we want to have a good as or better than industry retention, and we want to make sure that that holds true across different demographics that comprise our workforce. So I think those are pretty traditional ways of looking and saying, because on the one end, what you're doing is you're improving your practices, but you're not doing it just because you want to have great practices. You want to do it because you want to have great results. So you look at the result end, which is how effective are we in engaging people, how effective are we in attracting people, and also on the business side, when our salespeople go in and they talk to our clients about what we offer, and they also talk about our diversity programs, are those resonating as being done in a way that shows that we're taking leadership? So we measure using metrics that are related either to the business or related to how we're performing relative to attracting and engaging our workforce.
Do we have an audio question from the line of Carol Evans?
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Carol, how are you?
I'm great. I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. I have a question that I don't know the answer, so that's why I'm asking you. Do you think, is there much of a difference between affinity groups or ERGs for B2B companies than there is for consumer and B2C companies?
I think that the primary difference is in the area of how we can leverage an affinity network or an employee resource group as a way of probing their market. So if you, let's say, for example, sell makeup, and you want to sell makeup across a broad demographic, and you have a broad demographic in your employee group, you can certainly use that employee resource group as a way of giving you feedback on, are these the right, you think these shades will sell? Do you think these particular products will work? The car companies, I heard a great story one time about how one car company, and I forget who exactly, but one car company got input on how to modify one of their vehicles to make it more attractive to female customers who were the primary purchasers of the vehicle, in terms of comfort, in terms of being able to see children in the back seat, and a number of things like that. So those are things that I think a B2C can really leverage employee resource groups that are in the company that are willing to sort of lend a voice and help them to better understand the demographics of the consumers that they represent. Inside of B2B, they're not selling, they're selling a $5 million MRI machine to a hospital.
Right.
They're one step, maybe two steps removed from that consumer. But I think that there are opportunities to engage the people who are in these affinity networks and employee resource groups to better understand, for example, are we attractive to what makes up the demographic of the workforce that we're trying to bring into the company, whether it's engineers or financial people. Are we engaging? Are we able to retain people that are in our organization effectively? So from that standpoint, in terms of doing that, and for a company like Siemens, what it also helps to do is it helps to shrink the company and make the company feel like it's smaller and more, and something that the person can feel more connected to than a giant, faceless 70,000 person company. So I think that those are some of the distinctions. There are similarities that we can certainly have and the other, but there are also some differences.
Right, and maybe they also help see how you're landing in the community.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's so much in different areas that they can do in different, especially if they are in the, let's say in many cases, we don't sell a product to an end consumer, but there's an end consumer somewhere at the other side of our customer, right? So that gives us also that view as well.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Again, to ask an audio question, press star 1.
So we do have an online question from Alenda Young with Nelco Company. She asks, outside of the recruitment arena, do you have any suggestions on how to guide the company toward connecting D&I to the bottom line business?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in our particular case, you need to look at in terms of who your customers are. What are your different customer, the overused word demographic, but in other words, who do you do business with? Do you do business with a lot of consumer companies? Do you do business with the government? Do you do business? And what percentage of your business, what percentage of your total revenue do you have coming in from those different pieces of your business? And where, and in those particular markets, there are some markets where D&I in various shapes and forms becomes very key to the table stakes for a deal. So, for example, if you do business with certain organizations, they want a strong supplier diversity program. If you do business with certain organizations, they want to see that you are investing in veterans or in certain parts of the community. So if you can slice down the various businesses that they have and what that represents, 25 million, 250 million, 300 million, and what percentage that is of the total gross revenue of your company, then you can begin to draw a line between, how important is this to your business? And you can also answer the question, if we didn't do this at all, how much money would we lose? Which I think usually is an eye-opener for people because then they realize how important it is to their particular business. For business people, that's sort of like tends to be sometimes the hard line approach. The other approach is also to show the fact that, the softer approach is to show that in many of the service industries, your most precious commodity, your most precious tool for engaging and keeping your clients satisfied, coming back and engaged, are your people. the more you engage your people, the more engaging your people are to your client, the more business and retention that you have. So I don't know what kind of business but depending on the kind of business that you're in, there are a number of ways that you could tie that back to the particular business and show that there is a relevance to what you're doing, and that while this is the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do for their business.
Another question from Sherry Chappelle with Illinois Toolworks. She asks, how does Siemens address diversity outside of the United States?
Outside of the United States, we just actually, it's interesting because our diversity efforts, you heard me talk before about how I came into the role that I'm in 2005, and it was to pull together and form a USA diversity effort. But as I mentioned, the different efforts in the different divisions in the companies, like our energy company, which is celebrating a decade of one of their programs that they have, one of their diversity programs. They've had many diversity programs. And our medical, our healthcare sector, and the other companies within that form the industry sector, these companies have diversity programs going back for many, many years before I came into this role. Well, in true form, in the earlier part of this year, the company now has developed a global diversity effort and has nominated a global diversity officer, CDO, Chief Diversity Officer, by the name of Jill Lee. And in her role is really to link together all of these efforts around these different companies and these different countries around the world. And really the goal, if you look at the top level goal of our diversity efforts globally, it's 3 C's: composition, right, connection, and communication, which is in essence to make sure that our employee base, from the top to the bottom, from leadership to the people that are actually performing the work, are representative of the environments that we're in, and that we fully capitalize the talent that's available to us, and the connection pieces, that we bring these different talents together within countries as well as globally in order to create synergies for innovative products that address the needs of different parts of the globe where we operate. So we want to have the engineering expertise with different perspectives, as well of people who know how solutions should apply in one part of the world versus how they apply in another part of the world. And then the communication of this so that we all know what the other ones are doing, and we can leverage this effectively in all our companies, which is essentially what I was trying to do here in the United States originally. So that effort, while new, is picking up a lot of steam, because what Jill has discovered, very similar to what I discovered when I came into my role, is that we do have a lot of different diversity efforts going on in places like South Africa and other parts of the world, and the United States, obviously. And it's a matter of leveraging these, pulling them together, and tying them together to those higher level sort of global goals in place. So I hope that answered the question, because I felt like I was going on and on about this, but that question touched on a topic that I've just been talking about recently to another group. So that's why I sort of went off on it a little bit. But definitely those 3 C's are the focus of our global effort.
Catherine Cornish with MetLife asks, with a variety of companies under the Siemens umbrella, how do you align broad diversity goals to business goals?
Well, here's what we do. I mean, I think that the common denominators that all these businesses have are the following. Number one, they want to attract the most talented people across the broadest range of diversity. So we don't want to appeal to one demographic and not appeal to another demographic, and thereby create a constraint of resources. We want to appeal to the most talented people across the broadest demographic. We know for a fact that 80% of the people that we hire are engineers. So that's certainly an area of focus, whether it's engineering in the medical area or engineering in the energy area or engineering in other industrial areas. Engineering is the key area where we hire. We also know that that in order to be effective, we need to be able to fully engage and utilize as much of that talented person as we can. So we don't want to bring a person in and then use 50% of them or 25% of them, or to have them want to only be 10% there. We want them to want to be all there and to feel that their career is growing and that they're learning as well as contributing as much as they can and thereby be engaged. Commonality across all of our companies. In terms of business, the specific businesses that we have, we do a large percentage of business with the government across our different companies. We do a large percentage of business with a lot of large consumer organizations. And so even though we may, one company may be doing lighting and the other company may be doing the electrical, the energy production, and the other company may be doing the building, air conditioning and systems control and so forth, they tend to kind of overlap each other. And so we know who these customers are. We know what's important to these customers in terms of what they expect from us as a company, in terms of the kind of people that we send in, the level of engagement and dedication, the kind of services and the kind of product. So those are all commonalities, and we use those commonalities as the focus for how we develop solutions that can be used across those different companies. And that's how we develop that business case as well. We've developed it to envelop all those different needs that these different companies and their customers have. While at the same time we realize that whenever you build one of these practices, you have to allow some room for some level of flexibility in order to be effective with a specific client. Supplier diversity is a good example where what different clients, the kind of information that different clients want us to collect it may vary from industry to industry, from client to client. So we need to have a system that's robust enough and flexible enough that we could take our information and present it in whichever form it is needed for a particular client. So that's in essence what we've done in order to be able to build uniformity and build some singular form of governance and structure, while at the same time keeping some flexibility, is looking for those commonalities across what we want from talent and what we want in terms of being able to effectively brand and position with clients.
Operator, do we have any live questions?
There are no further audio questions at this time.
Okay, and that's it for the electronic questions.
I think everyone's gotten, I think it's a little over an hour, so we probably have exhausted everyone.
Joe, thank you so much. This is Sigrid Cinnamon speaking at Diversity Best Practices. You've shared a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and many tools and strategies that our members can take within and implement within their company as they see fit, specifically to your polling question at the beginning, as in how much would you take and shape and how much would you just copy and paste, so to speak. Again, I would like to remind everyone that this presentation will be posted on the diversitybestpractices.com website on the members-only site. Will be accessible there. And we've added a new feature, the audio feature, which will be posted after the call. So we should have this up probably by tomorrow, the audio component that you may be able to share with your team members. Just a reminder for Save the Date again, our next session, the Best Practices session on July 29th in Milwaukee, hosted by Johnson Controls. Hope to see you there. And for our annual Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Summit and Gala, October 6th and 7th in Washington, D.C., Gala being on the 6th, we hope you'll be able to make it there. Again, more information for all these pieces are on our website. Again, that is diversitybestpractices.com. The summit site is summit.diversitybestpractices.com. Again, everyone, thank you for joining today's call. Goodbye.